Well, welcome everybody. Happy Tuesday, and hope everyone is doing well, and wherever you are, you're keeping cool in the midst of summer. My name is Joe Swimmer. I am the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and we are very pleased to welcome you here today to this session on what's going on with giving, some insights from our friends at Horizon Stewardship on their annual report about giving to the church, and some other insights that they've garnered from third parties that they work with. I'm sure that you're going to find this an informative session, and looking forward to hosting them. There are several more digital workshops coming up in the next few weeks. So if the summer heat is getting to you, please join us tomorrow for one on how to fund your endowment. Next week, we'll have one on how treasurers in parish churches handle their work, and then some additional ones in August. So we look forward to welcoming you to those. And if you're not a member of Episcopal Parish Network, please talk to your parish folks about joining us. So we're grateful to have you here. We're grateful to have the folks from Horizons here. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Joe. Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Joe, thank you. Happy to be here for our presentation, what's going on with giving. So we're going to use data points that are from Giving USA. We're going to use data points that are from our own research. I'm going to show you how you can get at that. And then we're going to pivot to what you can do about some of these trends. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is our Giving 365 free resource library. It's at giving365.com. You can use a QR code there. This will come up later as well. It'll have a copy of this webinar. It'll have a copy of the research that I'm going to be talking about. It will not have the Giving USA slides in there, as they don't allow us to use them in that manner. We can't just give them away, but they will be happy to sell them to you. This is who I am. Horizons has been at this work for about 30 years. A large part of the work that we do is with the Episcopal community. And in our work, almost exclusively with mainline churches, we've helped raise about $10 billion, primarily in capital dollars. We don't have a great way to count what we're doing in terms of annual giving, but about half of the contracts we do today are focused on how to grow annual giving. They may have a capital component or not, but that has become increasingly a challenge for churches. And that's really what this webinar is about. My co-host today is Kristine Miller. She's well known in the Episcopal community. She is Executive Vice President, and you will enjoy hearing from her. So this is the 2024 findings that we're going to be citing a lot of data points from today. Giving USA, if you want to get this, you can pay them $149 and they'll be happy to provide it to you. We'll also be supplementing this with other information, as I said earlier, and I'll show you how you can find that. In fact, on Giving 365, you will be able to find the Horizons semi-annual worship and giving survey, where we break out churches by size and by geographical area, looking at their data points. I was also a co-collaborator with the Unstuck Group in a report that you can find in that same location. All right. The first thing I want to do is to look at economic conditions and their impact on giving. As you heard, we've got 40 folks that are involved in this work all around the country. And almost every time we go into a church, we will hear something about COVID or something about the economy. Before COVID, this, and after COVID, something different. It's the economy is now a good time. And I'm going to talk to you about what is, what was before COVID, and show you how it has impacted giving before I get into the 2024 USA report, which is using 2023 numbers. So 2023 numbers are the most current data points that we have on giving from Giving USA. So the reason I use 2018 is that was the first full year before COVID began to set in and create decline. You can see that since that point, the stock market was at 2,600. It closed in 2023, and this giving at 3,700. I looked it up today about 10 o'clock, and it was right at 41. So if giving is dependent on the stock market, we should be in the best of times. GDP, how's the economy doing? It was growing about 2.9% in 2018. It was growing about 3.3% in 2023, which is actually currently it's growing about 1.5%, and that's because the Fed's trying to cool it off. It got too hot. And it created the next thing that we'll talk about, and that is inflation, which was at 2.5% or 2.15% in 18. It got up as high as 8%. It has fallen to 3.4% in 2023, and now core inflation in 2024 is fallen below 3%. The goal of the Fed is not to get it to zero, but their perfection point is right at 2%. Unemployment, 3.9, 3.7 last year. Right now it's at 4.1. That's all part of Fed trying to cool the economy so that they can lower interest rates. And you see the biggest factor, the biggest change here is we were at historically low interest rates in 2018, and the 30-year mortgage is right at 6.8% today. Household income has grown about 15%. So let's explore this idea of the stock market. Stock market's not a good place. How is that impacting giving? So this slide shows you the correlation between the stock market. This one is using the S&P 500 as an example, and giving. And you can see while they are somewhat correlated, they're not terribly closely correlated. So when people do talk about the stock market and its impact, it may impact them individually, but in terms of overall giving, it has a much more blunted impact over time than people give it credit for. In fact, there's this funny thing. The economy, as a rule, is in pretty good shape today by most economists' standards. Inflation's a little bit high, but the stock market's going up. The job market is still on the positive side. If you ask individuals how they think the economy is going, the majority of people say they think the economy is going poorly. But about 2/3 of those people say, now, my personal economy is going pretty well. So there's a big difference. You total all that up, then you would assume 2/3 of people would say things are pretty good. That's not what they hear on the news. So they reflect back what they hear on the news, but their realities are different than what you hear reported on television news. And that's important when you're talking with donors, is if they're projecting about what they think, how's our church, those aren't going to give you really good numbers because they're just reflecting what they've heard from their neighbors and on the television. When you ask them just to share from their own perspective, it tends to be actually much better, which is what we find every time we do a feasibility study with churches. We ask them to answer individually, and we get a more positive number. So question is now, do we have a giving problem in the United States? We're going to explore that. It may depend on your definition of giving, but is giving going down? Are we getting less generous as Americans? And what we saw from 2018 to 2023 was a 44% rise in total dollars. Now, I encourage you to be careful with total dollars because as a church leader, what you're concerned about is not how much what percent increase we had in our ministry funding, but what percent of increase we had above inflation. It's your purchasing power you want to watch. And that number right there is just the total gross dollars, which on the surface looks really good. So if we look at this chart, this comes from Giving USA, we'll begin to see the difference. Current dollars, that's non-inflation, that's this black line. And you can see that going up. It will meet inflation adjusted up here at the top. These numbers are inflation adjusted, and that shows really the difference based on your purchasing power. And then what's interesting about this is these yellow marks indicate times of recession. And as a rule, while it is correlated to, it is not absolutely correlated to giving. So giving goes up in some recessions, giving goes down in some recessions. You can see here, it remained relatively flat. Here, not much change. In 2007 and 8, we saw that almost 50% reduction in the stock market, and that took a number of years to recover from. And then again, during COVID, we saw a decline. So that's giving has continued to go up. If we look at giving and measure it in three primary ways. One is total giving, inflation or not. I would always encourage you to use the inflation adjusted number. The other is as a percentage of our gross domestic product. This represents whether we get wealthier as a nation or less wealthy as a nation. It is our gross domestic product. Everything that is created, the entire economy rolled together. And what we saw was in 2018, we were giving about 1.8% of the American gross domestic product. That increased to 2% in 2023. That's a 10% increase. You would think that would be really good. Well, what I want to show you with that is that giving as a percent of gross domestic product remains relatively consistent. In fact, if we were to roll this whole number all the way back to the 60s, we would see it roughly right at 2%, 1.8, 1.9, 2.1%. It did begin to go up in the 90s, kind of correlated with the growth in stock. That meant in the 90s, that meant as a country, we got more wealthy, but even though we're more wealthy, we're not actually giving any more or any less than we did before. So giving as percentage of gross domestic product has remained relatively flat since the 60s. And so it's not good, it's not bad, it's just the same. And it's stayed the same throughout most of our lifetimes. Now, here's a slightly more complicated one. It's giving as a percentage of disposable income. This gets now down to the American household. And disposable income, you can think of that as income after taxes. So our tax rates will impact this somewhat. And you would see in 2018 that it was 1.9%, fell to 1.7 in 2023, an 11% decline. That really has to do with household take home versus GDP. But again, as we look at that over time, it basically has remained flat since the 60s, right at that same 2%. It will go up and down tiny amounts. It tends to it tends to be a lagging indicator. But what I want you to take away from this is that we don't have a giving problem. It's the same as it's always been in the United States. What we have is a giving to the church problem. And that's what I want you to walk away with today. When somebody says people just don't give like they used to give, that's not true. They just don't give to the church like they used to give. And now we're going to look at why. So as we look at giving to religion in 2018, it was 128 billion, 145 billion last year, a 12% increase over that period of time. On the surface, that looks good, but remind you, we're worried about inflation. If we go all the way back to 1983, giving has gone up by 114 billion. I just wanted you to see what 114 billion look like. So if we're just looking at top dollars, we think everything is rosy. And yet I'm going to make the case that this is a time to be alarmed. This chart shows us current giving to religion. And this shows us on an inflation adjusted basis. So what you can see is we've actually been in decline since about 2015 in terms of our purchasing power after inflation. In fact, it's pretty consistent. We've got to go back here to almost 2000 before we see any significant increase in giving. And remember, in that period of time, we also saw an increase in giving in relationship to our GDP. So when we're looking at it from an after or an inflation adjusted basis, our purchasing power has been going down. In fact, if we want to compare 2018 to 2023, we lost 15% of our purchasing power. Let that soak in. 15% of our purchasing power, and giving remained the same. It went somewhere else. It didn't. It didn't come to us. So 128 billion in 2018 would be worth the same as it'd only be worth 109 today in terms of purchasing power. And this is, for me, the most concerning of all of the data points that I'm going to bring to you today. I've been doing this work since 2001. I was a bank CEO before that. I felt a call into ministry. I've been doing this work, and this trend has been working against the church since then. It is the percent of total giving that basically 2% of GDP or 2% of disposable income that Americans give. It was at 29% in 2018. It fell to a record low 24% or a 17% decline. So we have two things working against us. We've got a decline in our purchasing power due to inflation, and the percentage of the pie, which remains very consistent, that belongs to religious organizations, which is really churches and our judicatories. It's not religious nonprofits unless they're owned by our judicatories. So there are nonprofits out there that are doing things in the name of Jesus, but not counted in this, not counted in this number. So that's the scenario. And if I'm a church leader, I'm really concerned. It means that if I haven't grown my giving by more than 15% in the last 6 years, then I have gone backwards in terms of the ministry funding that I'm able to present. Now, this is by recipient. And this is what I was telling you is my most concerning number. You can see the 5-year period of time from 2019 to 2023, we averaged just 26% of the pie. This year, the last year in that 5-year span, it's fallen to 24%. Then it was 31, before that 34, 35, 36, 44, 57. It goes all the way into the 60s. In the 80s, we had some numbers where we were getting 60%. Today, only 24% of total giving. So where's it going? It's going to a lot of places. This is again a Giving USA slide. It shows the 24% that went to religion, 14% to human services, education, grant making, and foundation. We're going to talk about that for just a minute because that is a change that you want to be aware of. These other numbers, they are, as a rule, going up. Giving to religion is going down. Now, we are one of the most stable. Our changes happen more slowly than they do to some of these other areas that are more impacted by annual giving trends, but the trend is moving downward and it is picking up a lot of steam. So if we carry this out, we're going to see a third of churches be unsustainable in 5 years unless they change their trajectory. So this is a chart, a GWIS chart. It shows you this is decline. This is the side that's rising. It is 2023 and 2022 in the orange, and then 2023 the most current. What you can see is just in that two segment period of time from 21 through 23, after inflation, we lost 4%. Most of the other columns, you can see that they grew. A few dropped radically. That's what I was telling you. But mostly, religion has been going down. It has been on the negative side. And of the top 10 that are being categorized here, if we go back over the last 5, 7 years, probably even before, we'd see that religion is lagging behind almost everybody, even though from year to year, some of those move around pretty quickly. So where's money coming from? 67% come from individuals, 7% from corporations, 8% from bequest, and 19% from foundations. This foundation number also includes donor advised funds, DAFs, which are becoming a really important part of giving as more and more people are putting their money into a donor advised fund. They're getting to take that tax deduction immediately. The giving is actually delayed, so there's almost always a difference between what's given and what's paid out in the foundation world. But what I want to show you, excuse me. What I want to show you is this remains relatively consistent. Individuals, they used to give around 80%. It's fallen to around 67%. The difference is primarily individuals giving to foundations through donor advised funds or directly to foundations. The one thing I want to point out in the foundation world is if you're giving to a community foundation, when you pass away, you can look at where they give their money today, and that's where they're going to be giving your money. There are religious foundations that have a much more narrow focus, and so they will be returning those dollars after you die, and they have control over it in your donor advised funds. They'll be returning them to their core functions. So look carefully before you move your money to a community foundation, and be sure where they're giving their money is where you like it to go, because that's actually where most of your money will end up going. It's not changing much by source, so I'm just going to jump on that. I do want to say there's some other trends that are concerning, and that is where is the money coming from? This is from a donor analytics software called Mortarstone. We recommend churches over $1 million seriously consider using it. The cost would be about $150 a month, and it sits on top of your software and allows you to get this kind of visibility with the information that you're already putting in. So in our work at Horizons, we see an increasing amount of giving from people who are are in the retirement age. This is actually a snapshot of a church, and you can see that in these donor bands, and these are the top 3 donor bands. These are very small amounts of giving. These are the top donor bands, and you can see that giving from people over 70 is highly concentrated there. Many of our churches, you can apply an actuarial table to your donor base and see when you will become insolvent. And you can do that because you can see if you're going to become insolvent. You can look at your younger donors and their trends and your older donors and their trends. And unless you are doing something to cultivate that, those giving trends are not going to change. That takes work. Simply getting older is not going to cause someone to want to give more money to the church, but the church across the board, and Episcopal churches are at the greatest risk of most churches for aging, is significant. This is where bequests become a really important factor. So if you are not asking your donors if they have remembered your church as a child or a grandchild in their estate plan, then you are missing an opportunity, and that wealth transfer is going to take place. And the children of the people who are supporting you have different giving habits. Fewer are giving. Now, I showed you before, this is individuals. That all remains fairly consistent. The only shift we see in individual giving is really from the into foundations, and that is individual giving. When you look at, apart from foundations, corporations, and bequests remain relatively consistent, and that's at these bottom numbers down here. This is also a slide from a church client that is using mortar stone. And I want to show you this because it is very typical of giving in a church. If you don't have this kind of visibility into your giving, I would encourage you to ask for that. You can give us a call. We can make the introductions and coach you on how to use this software. But this band 5, that would be donors over 10,000 a year. But what you're seeing is just about 11% of donors are giving right at 52% of the total giving in that church. The majority of the givers are giving, in fact, half the givers are basically giving 3%. So remember this, half of most mainline church rolls, half of those people don't give anything. Of the ones they do, somewhere close to half give less than $200 or $300 a year to the church. So when you start talking about, well, we've got this many donor households, it's not very helpful because half of those are giving at such a low level, they're not really moving the needle. That we are seeing an increasing concentration in this top level of giving. And by the way, on this software, you can change the settings. If you don't want that range to be 10,000 and up, it can be something else. But as our rule of thumb at Horizons, and we see this consistently, is that somewhere between 5 and 10% of donor households, the half that are giving about 2/3 of the total amount in the church. And we call those financial leaders. And if you want to find your financial leaders, get your giving records, sort them high to low, some all the way down until you get to 2/3 of your giving. Those are your financial leaders. And there are communication strategies that they need that are different than others. Couple other things that I want to hit real quickly. There's also a shifting of wealth to the upper 1%. 2020 is the most recent data point that I have on this, where it was measured consistently. And from 1990 to 2020, the upper 1% share of wealth went up 29%. The upper 1% owns half of everything today. And here's where it came from. If you're in the upper 20%, you broke even. If you're 40% and up, you lost a little bit. And if you're in the bottom 60%, and most Episcopal churches, these folks are not really in your church, but that group of households has gotten hammered in terms of wealth, and income doesn't look particularly different from that. If you want to know why, we can talk about that in the Q&A. This is actually last year's data. I didn't update it, but it's close enough. You can see to be in the upper 1%, you're going to need about $11 million in wealth, or about 570 in income. And it shocks people to see upper 20%. Well, that's 149,000 in household income. That's both spouses, if there are both people in the household. So most of your donors are actually right in here. Most churches don't have strategies focused on pointed at them. The last thing I want to say is I made the point that giving in America is essentially flat. There's no more giving than there was before in terms of purchasing power or percent of our wealth. But the competition is growing significantly. You can see there are since 2012, there are 400,000 more 501c3s competing for the same pie that hasn't gotten any bigger than 2% of GDP. And this is our primary failure in the church, as people have moved from thinking of the church as the place that they give first, that they place their tithe. So you can teach someone, give them the answer to why give, and they can choose to be generous based on that. I would certainly say there's a part of that is the intervention of the Holy Spirit, but you have to answer this next question: why give to you? Because the reason that these numbers are happening is not primarily because the younger donors are not giving, or the nuns, or anything else. It is primarily because our best donors are choosing to make the church a lower and lower priority. Among high capacity donors, there's a study done every year by one of the major financial groups, and it shows that the church is usually fourth or fifth on the giving priorities of those high capacity donors, that really roughly upper 5%. So I'm going to uh, I'm going to skip over this slide so Kristine can talk about one of the things that we can do. But again, this is just making the point that wealth is owned by fewer people. And here's the good news. The good news is, in our worship and giving study, the majority of churches saw increases in giving. Around almost 40% of churches, a million and up, increased more than inflation. The churches that were having the hardest time were those with giving between 100,000 and a half a million. Only 39% of that group grew, and only 20 something percent grew faster than inflation. So what I want you to know is that churches in every single size group are thriving and are doing well. And the majority of churches are seeing increases, and a third of them are increasing more than inflation. So where are you? If you want to be on that thriving side, here's some things that you might want to consider. And we call this an integrated funding strategy. Kristine?
Thanks, Joe. Before we move on, there was a question about Mortarstone. Would you like to just say a little bit more about people are eager to see their own data replicated in those giving bands?
Yes, you can go to mortarstone.com, and they can sell it to you directly. They'll charge you for the onboarding. You can do it with an introduction for us, and if you work through us, you don't get discounted pricing. We used to have that, but not anymore. What you do get is a level of coaching so that you know how to make sure that the data that's being pulled out is properly coded, and that you have a strategy to change the number. But if you just want to go up and sign up for Mortarstone, you can do that right now, mortarstone.com. And when I work with churches, I really only work with them if they are going to use Mortarstone, because if I can't see behind the numbers down to the stories, and you can drill all the way down to the individual household, fantastic stuff. So Kristine, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Shout out to all you people out there. I see a lot of familiar faces on the participant list. So welcome. So glad you're here. There was a question about how do we communicate to the top 2/3? So glad you asked. We're going to be talking about that in just a moment. So stay tuned for that, because that's a really, really key point of growing generosity. Joe is filling out this, well, as he called it, the integrated funding model that Horizons created. We've been working on this and sort of tweaking it over the last few years. And what this is a representation of the evolution really today of how churches are funding annual ministry. It used to be that it was pretty simple, right? It was pledges, and then we spent it on ministry. It was pretty straightforward. It is no longer quite so straightforward. Each one of these areas is equally important and valuable. I'm going to be taking you through the center portion, what we call our 6 disciplines. So we'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's important to note the outer ring as well. Again, annual giving strategies has been our primary focus in the church. We are a pledging denomination, and so that's been our primary focus for giving. We also do special offerings. On special Sundays, we might do a special offering for a particular ministry initiative or denominational initiative. Plan giving strategies. Most of our Episcopal churches have some sort of a legacy society and plan giving program and endowment fund. And then capital giving strategies. Many of our churches have embarked on capital campaigns for maintenance of our beautiful facilities that we love but are aging, and for other capital initiatives as well. The one that may be less familiar to you is the asset strategies. And this is something that we're seeing more and more of. Many of our churches are looking at ways that they can leverage their facilities to gain some additional revenue. So if that's something that you've been talking about or interested in, let us know. We've been doing some research, and we've got some ministry partners that have done this very successfully. And so if that's something you might be looking at, we might be able to help you with that. Now to that inner circle, you'll see at the center of that is vision. Obviously, vision is extraordinarily important. It is the foundation for everything that we do, and everything that we raise resources for is in order for us to achieve God's vision for our ministry. People need to be able to know where the church is going, need to be able to have some ownership and buy into that in order for them to want to help fund it. So vision is really key. One question I typically ask churches is, if you're doing the same that you did last year in terms of mission and ministry, why should your donors be excited about giving more? Right? As Joe mentioned, there's a lot of faith-based nonprofit organizations doing a lot of God's work out there. And so, and most of those have a very clear vision and compelling vision for its future. So if you're doing your budget process and you're just doing what you did last year, you might ask yourselves, why would people want to be excited about funding more when you haven't presented a vision for more? So vision is really the core of all the things that we do, and really the center of our strategy. So in the Keep It Spiritual, I'm going to just take you through those 6 disciplines, and what those are. We found in those thriving churches in our research that they all have a few things in common. One is that they have a clear and compelling vision for the future. We just talked about that. Another one, in no particular order, although I would say this one's probably the most important, is keeping it spiritual. It's important that we help people to understand their relationship to giving, generosity, and discipleship. When people grow in their generosity, they do grow in their relationship to God. It really is an important part of our work as the church, is to teach this spiritual aspect of giving and generosity. At Horizons, we like to talk about giving and generosity as a journey that is grounded in gratitude, revealed through prayer, and lived in faith. It really is all about becoming more like the person God intended us to become more like God's image. And so when we connect generosity with discipleship, we're inviting people to go on that journey to find out and discover what God has in mind for them, and for their relationship with God. So keeping it spiritual is essential. For those of you that are clergy that are preaching and teaching on this, it's just vital for people to understand it. We can't presume that people, even mature Episcopalians, cradle Episcopalians, have necessarily picked this up along the way. And so preaching and teaching and talking about generosity from a spiritual perspective is a great starting point for growing people in their generosity. So when we teach people about giving and generosity from a spiritual perspective, we're helping them answer the question, why should I give and be generous? But there's a second question that's equally important, which is, why should I give and be generous to you, to your church? As Joe mentioned, on the priority list, the church is often 4th, 5th, sometimes lower than that, on a list of charities that might be 7, 8, 9, 10 long. And so how do we compel people to want to give to support the mission and ministry of your church? One of the primary ways to do that is telling your ministry story. This can happen in a lot of different ways. We know Jesus used stories all the time to make a point. And so we can do the same. For those of you who want more information about this, Joe talked to you about Giving 365. There are some additional resources there, but I'm just going to run through a couple of quick ways that you can tell stories. We have a wonderful time in the liturgy in the Episcopal Church where we do the offertory. We have an offertory sentence, and that is a perfect opportunity for you to be able to connect your church's impact with the donations and generosity of your congregation. We're getting ready to offer our gifts to God. Let's talk about how those gifts are being used through the ministry of St. Swithins. So telling your ministry story can happen in offering talks. It can happen in quarterly statements that you're sending to people. Let them know what you're doing with the important resources that they provided to you. Take a look at your website. I was looking at some research from Lake Institute, and they said that 77% of church givers are using at least one form of digital giving. 77%. So this is no longer the exception, but it is the rule. And 66% are using it exclusively. So making sure that we are using the website wisely to make sure we're using those digital features. All right, the next discipline is building giver or investment relationships. And this is the answer to the, how do we talk to those 2/3 that are giving so much? When someone makes a contribution, specifically a contribution at the highest level, they're making an investment. They want to know that their resources that they provided to you are having an impact. So help them know what the stories are. Tell them specifically. For those of you out there who might go apoplectic when I say this, but the rector absolutely needs to know the giving list. This is a question that Joe and I have been asking or answering our entire careers. Should the clergy know the giving list? The absolute answer is yes, yes, yes. You are the CEO of your organization and executive director, and should know who the people are that are investing most heavily in the ministry. This is of course, happens not just with the annual giving, but with planned giving as well. We ought to know who those people are that have given the wealth of a lifetime to support the church in perpetuity. One of the important things I want to say about this is we also need to make sure that we're earning the right to make the ask. The clergy needs to be able to make the ask with integrity, knowing that the relationship has come first. So knowing who those people are, inviting them to weigh in to whatever ministry initiatives are happening, giving them an opportunity to offer some feedback. And many of these folks want to invest more in the mission ministry of the church. But they don't know where or why or how to do so. So having conversations, knowing what their philanthropic objectives are, know what their family situations are, so that you can help guide them in those really important conversations, and help them invest in the ministry. One final note about building relationships is, especially for those churches that have the scenario that Joe laid out with the older congregations, our senior saints providing the most significant portion of the giving, invite them to consider endowing their annual gift. Many of them are able to. They don't want to pull their resources and have you lose a staff position. They want to make sure that the church is solid now and into the future. So invite them to think about ways that they might be able to endow their annual gift so that when they pass, the church continues to benefit from their generosity. The next discipline is about measuring effectiveness. We want to make sure that what the strategies that we're putting together actually have an impact. And we want to make sure that we're actually using those resources wisely for those strategies. Why do givers stop giving? We don't typically ask them, but when anecdotally we know that sometimes they're angry, sometimes there's been a job change, sometimes there's been a health issue. Again, it's why it's so important that the rector and clergy know what's going on with giving, because sometimes it's a cry for help. So knowing those changes in personal dynamics is really important. We want to make sure that if somebody gives to the church for the first time, they're saying, I like what I'm seeing here, and I'm really wanting to invest in this, but they may just give you a gift to test the waters to see how you'll manage it. So having a first-time giver strategy to make sure that that person gives again and again, it becomes a lifelong donor to your church. Important to make sure that we have that strategy in place, and then make sure that you're measuring its success. The Mortarstone data that Joe presented earlier is going to provide you with a ton of different data points if that's something that you're interested in. But in the meantime, if you are just measuring your average gift, which is what our parochial reports ask us to measure, you're missing some really key data points. So average is one story that you want to tell. But again, when we've got a lot of giving happening with a few families, it's going to really skew that average, probably disproportionately. So it's not going to be as helpful to see an average growing year over year. But what is important to take a look at average as well as your median, as well as your mode. So take a look at those 3 data points and take a look to see that all of those are shifting and changing. And that's how you'll know that you're really growing generosity in your parish. All right, the last discipline I'll talk about is maintaining trust and accountability. There's been several scandals, and we're putting them up here on the slide. Some of the scandals you may be familiar with maintaining trust. I actually worked with a diocese years ago that had $1 million embezzled from a capital campaign fund that and he was an employee of the diocese. Really, really harsh and horrible that happens. But church members want to know that there is accountability and that they can trust that their giving is going to go for purposes intended, and that you're going to use those gifts well and wisely. Too many scandals have created a sense of distrust, perceptions that the church may not be fully trustworthy. So transparency, credibility, trust, all of those things are really vital to make sure that people feel that the money that they're giving to you is going to be used well and wisely. I'm going to stop there and see what other questions have popped up in the chat.
Kristine, I have seen a lot of questions pop in the chat yet, but certainly would encourage people to begin to populate that. I do want to say one thing about each one of those disciplines that Kristine went through. Um, we used to say we do an assessment we call a next level generosity discovery assessment. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to nextlevelgenerosity.com, and it sort of lays out a menu where you can choose and pick some of the different levels of the work that we do. But there's 30 to 35 different recommendations that might fall into that, or different strategies. And so you can also think of those disciplines as like buckets holding strategies. And those strategies are largely laid out on an individual basis in our Giving365.com. If you do go there and sign up for access to Giving365.com, you'll also receive a bi-weekly blog, which you can also find listed there. There have been about 70,000 people that have subscribed to that. We've got something like 45,000 that are engaging in it regularly. And so it is, there is information there that people are finding valuable. Kristine, there's a question here. If the church had an unsuccessful, incomplete capital campaign, what are some of the ideas about how to communicate and heal the disappointment and loss of trust?
That's a really great question. I guess I need to know a little bit more about that campaign and why it was unsuccessful or incomplete. Perhaps it was that the church maybe reached a bit farther than it was able to fund. That could very well be the case. Um, Certainly, there is disappointment when that occurs. Again, transparency is going to be key. I worked with a church recently that had a similar situation. They went into significant debt, buried it, didn't talk about it for about 5 years. When they called a new rector, the rector, after being there for about 6 months, realized that they had this debt. And guess what? The balloon payment was coming in the next year. So that was that you don't want to get yourself in that kind of a situation where it's buried and then all of a sudden you have to come clean. It's more important to be honest and tell people where you are. Most people will respect that, and set some expectations for what's next. Let people know what you need to do in order to complete the capital campaign, or maybe downsize your project, and go from there. But it's just so critical that people understand. We did everything we needed to do. We were prayerful, we were faithful, we did great work, and we came short. And so what do we do next from here?
So one of the best things that Horizons has found, particularly since COVID, we did this with some churches before COVID, after COVID, because so much really has changed. You can't count on what was still being where people are today. Is to look at a capital campaign and do what we call pre-campaign development. It is working with ministry and financial leaders to engage them in the vision early on, so that the vision is carried to them in a soft form, meaning it's not been approved by the vestry. You're not making an ask. You're saying, this is what our building committee or our mission team or whatever came up with that plan, thinks is going to have this kind of outcome. We create a case statement. The vestry says, yes, let's test that. And so the idea is aligning your financial and ministry leaders around that. And what we see is there's a significant amount of shaping happening through that process, but it's also very, very good donor development, because your best donors are your ministry and financial leaders, and they're the ones that are leaning in. They're getting to put their fingerprints on it. They don't have control over it. That belongs to the vestry, but the vestry gets their feedback. And in larger churches, we typically are actually doing the feasibility study with the ministry and financial leaders to project the range of giving, that because your financial leaders just in among themselves are giving you 2/3 of your total giving, even though they're a small percent of the total community. We want to make sure before we take a vision to the church, socialize that, and then let everybody in the church participate in a feasibility study. We want to make sure that the financial leaders are willing to give at the level necessary to make that successful. So it takes more energy on the front end, a lot of cultivation, a lot of drawing people together. The actual capital campaign happens pretty fast, because what happens is you will then do a quiet phase and launch your public campaign, and you're already holding 50 to 75% of the total giving when you do that. So the rest of your church outside the committed core of your church is really finishing the work started by the leaders, and that aligns with First Chronicles 29, which is where we draw that from. Kristine, have you picked a question out?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions here. It says, some members of our parish are very uncomfortable linking financial generosity and their spiritual growth. Can you suggest strategies to help with that concern? I love that question. We actually occasionally work with some clergy who are kind of uncomfortable with linking financial generosity with spiritual growth. Joe, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, but I would just lead with saying it's got to be preached and taught from the pulpit. It's got to be something that is intentionally talked about without apology. And for those of you who maybe are looking for a resource, and most of you know about the resources, Henry Nouwen's A Spirituality of Fundraising it's a classic. It's not new. But there's a workbook that's a newer piece that I would highly recommend that takes you through on a Q&A, sort of a book study, if you will, and could be really helpful to people who are still struggling with that. But it's people really, it takes time. Our society is fighting against us in that. Society tells us otherwise. But we know how important giving and generosity was to Jesus, and the scriptures that point in that direction are abundant. And so hopefully there'll be an opportunity as you're preaching to focus on that and to really help people to understand and make that connection. Joe, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I first I want to affirm everything you said. Horizons does a guided annual giving campaign that is focused on exactly that, not building the budget, but growing people spiritually. And what we have seen is much, much, much higher results, typically double-digit increases in commitments for the coming year. The two that I did personally this year, one church is up 16%, one is up 18% in actual giving thus far through the year, and it's built on a spiritual foundation, and that's really the work we're in. But frequently, we have to start with clergy and leaders, getting them comfortable with the idea. But we have set a process that takes a lot of that fear out, and it is. We've been doing it for several years, and it's just been phenomenal for us. We call that Pathways to Generosity. There's another question that I see in here, and that is someone is asking, how is it that you can do annual capital plan giving? How can that all be going on at the same time? And the reason is explained in that integrated funding strategy I was telling you about, that chart. It's because we use a single set of foundational principles for all of it. what tends to happen is you've got a capital campaign, somebody comes in and they're using one methodology and you describing words one way. Every year you make up a new annual campaign theme and process and new shiny penny to try to increase estimates of giving or pledges. And we have set all that aside and encourage churches to begin with a theology of generosity, which gets right back to that question Kristine was answering. And then that theology of generosity becomes a style guide for communication to follow so that we are using the proper words in the proper way. And everything then begins to build on each other. And there isn't a conflict between them. They are different. They're different ways of giving. People have different motivations. We will always say the annual giving is most important. Don't take and shift giving from annual to capital, or a planned gift happens after death, but you could make a foundational gift out of current assets. But we're always trying to protect the annual giving, because when somebody decides they're going to become a percentage giver and start giving a percent of their income each year, that is really an annuity. People don't tend to back away on their giving when they make that based on a spiritual decision. They tend to grow on it. Capital campaigns at the end of the 3 years or 2 years or 5 years, whatever time frame you have, that money evaporates. It does not flow back into the ministry budget of the church. And if anybody tells you that, I don't think there are statistics for it. One other little bit of information is in 2 weeks, we'll be dropping a blog on these 4 trends that I discussed today. And one of the things that I'll talk about is that discipleship piece and show you statistically how people that are engaged in small groups, how people that are engaged in serving ministries radically outgive people who are coming to worship 2 times a month. And that is part of the spiritual development, the spiritual formation that we see tied up in your theology of generosity. I know we are over time. We will stay and continue to answer questions. This is being recorded, and we'll break the questions and answers out. And continue to work on that as long as people are interested. But I do recognize that that hour that you originally committed to is up. But we'll, Kristine and I'll stay as long as there are churches asking questions.
So here's one, Joe, about how do you recognize generous donors without intimating that they will be calling the shots and making less generous donors feel bad? That's a great question and kind of loaded in a couple of ways. But the first thing is, and this may come as a surprise to some of my Episcopal brothers and sisters out there. Most donors these days don't really want to name anything after themselves. So that is a trend. There's actual data that suggests that people really don't typically want that anymore. It's a question I always get asked, what about naming opportunities? And as long as I've been doing this work, I've never named anything in any church. So that kind of recognition, if that's what you're talking about, really isn't a big problem anymore. But saying thank you to donors, expressing gratitude to donors is critically important, whether they're big donors or small donors, because we know that sometimes our most generous donors aren't necessarily the largest donors. Some of our most generous donors, some of our Widows' Mite donors, might fall a little bit lower on the giving list, but we need to recognize and express gratitude to them as well. One of the things that we do, as Joe mentioned, talked about our next level generosity discovery process. We talk to churches about how they're expressing gratitude to their donors of all sizes. and help them to identify some strategies that they might put into place that will help create a real culture of gratitude so that people feel that their contributions actually matter, that their investments make a difference, and that makes donors of all levels feel great. Um, so I would say if you have a question about that, look on Giving 365, and there are more resources there about expressing gratitude to donors.
So there's a follow-up question somebody asked about how do you keep from repeatedly making ask on
Mhm.
donors? I think that's a very legitimate question, and donor fatigue can be problematic. So we encourage churches limit the number of ask and special requests that they make over the course of the year. They combine some things when they do it. They do it in a large way, but we're going to advocate that every Sunday that the priest or a representative from a generosity committee is connecting either giving to generosity to spiritual growth or giving to impact. So telling a story of impact. This was made possible by your generous giving of your time, your talents, and your treasures. Don't if you mix those up too much, people will uh, hear that as a smorgasbord. I'll give my time, my talent, or my treasures, and we don't see it that way. We see it basically, what have you been entrusted with? What's in your hand, and how do you steward that? And that is the question that we're constantly asking people to have a conversation with God about, because we can't really tell them what God wants from them. There are some biblical marks out there like tithing and being clear what tithing is and its reference, and that gives some markers for people. But my understanding of the tithe is that's really the starting point of generosity, that God called the tithe as belonging to God for the work of the church. And so what we do with the 90% really is what defines us from a generosity perspective. Certainly people have to grow into that setting, and that's not something you're going to make happen. The Holy Spirit's going to make that happen. You are simply inviting people to have that conversation, and you are informing them with data and information. You are inspiring them with stories of transformation, and you are inviting them to take the next step that God is calling them to do. It is, we're big advocates for donor-centric conversations, not church-centric. Don't make it about the church's need. Make it about the value to the donor in joining God and what God is already doing through the church. The resources are out there. When we make it about us, it lands in their head. There are defenses that come up when we talk about the benefits to the donor, and they are multitude. Now, I'm not talking prosperity gospel. I'm talking about things that are substantiated throughout the scriptures. Joy being one of those, peace being one of those. That these are things that we talk about as outcomes, as well as a transformed life. So we're transformed. We help transform someone else, and that's the beauty of God's economy and the resources we're entrusted. We share. God wants us to enjoy some of it. God wants us to invest some of it, and to be strategic about that. And that's the place the church is missing out, because we're talking about why people uh, should give, but we're not making the case effectively while we are a good steward of those resources. So when you flip it around and come at it from the donor's perspective, it gets much less scary, and donors will hear it and respond. And it also helps us to stay accountable, because we are accountable to God, how we steward those resources that we've been entrusted with as leaders of the church.
So question here about, you mentioned, Joe, about a third of churches will be unsustainable in 5 years. Asking if that's an Episcopal church statistic or mainline, which it is mainline, not Episcopal churches. And the question is, are there any dioceses that are assessing their parishes and addressing this challenge directly? I'm sure there are some. I do know that I'm working with the Episcopal Diocese of Alabama right now. Bishop Curry, not presiding Bishop Curry, but Bishop Glenda Curry, is there doing an incredible job. Jeff Evans, who's her canon to the ordinary, is doing all of that assessment work, and they're actually planting churches in the Diocese of Alabama. So hang on to your hats, people. There are new church plants in the Episcopal Church that are happening and doing really, really well. So Jeff Evans, I think, would be a great resource for you if you're looking for somebody to be a conversation partner about that.
And I'm not ready to give up on a third of churches. I'm simply saying if you take the trend, if that trend line continues in those churches and they don't bend it upward, they will not be sustainable. I'm pro-church. I think God's got a plan, and if we come alongside that, then some extraordinary things can happen that are beyond just what we planned, and that's that. That's the Holy Spirit moving ahead of us.
Mhm. People were interested in the giving bands that you shared. If you could say what those are, can we put that maybe on the slide that people can grab hold of?
Um, yeah, I don't know if I can explain it and do that at the same time. But I can put them in the chat when I finish. These are the preset giving bands that come in Mortarstone. We usually default to them. They're a pretty good array, but you can actually change them. The ones that you saw illustrated were band one is under $200 a year in annual giving. And that's where across the country, about half of people who make a donation to the church fall into that category. That's Mortarstone's number. Then the next band is 0 to 199. The next band is 200 to 1,000. The next band is, I'm going to not use 99s, 1,000 to 2,500, 2,500 to 5,000, 5 to 10, and over 10. So that's how the giving is arrayed. The concern, and you, if you just look at it in your church, by taking ask your treasurer to give you households by annual giving over the last 12 months. They should be able to pull that off very quickly. And then just hit the sum button and run down the column, and you'll see how far you get when you reach that. That 2/3. Those are your ministry leaders right there, and most of them will tend to fall in band 4 and 5. If yours don't, you may need to adjust the bands, but that's an easy thing to do. The main thing is not what the bands are, but that you remain consistent over time, because the beautiful thing about Mortarstone is everything you can drill down on. So if it says there are 99 donors that are 70 plus that give in this range, you can click on them. It gives you their household names, and you can click on that, and it will show you their 5-year annual giving, what causes they gave to. You can click on that. You can look and see how they give. Motorstone has a predictive feature that when people start giving off their regular trend, it starts lifting up those names to you to check on them. And of course, you don't want to be checking on them for the money. You want to be checking on them for the relationship, because that's usually what has happened, or something else that's a pastoral concern, or something as simple as they moved. But it will help you get in front of changes in giving patterns. It allows you to do first-time donor strategies. Easy to do first-time donors because you have to set up a donor number in your church management software. But how do you get that second gift? How do you know when that third gift comes? And this one, you can set up task and it will simply give you the names. Here's the people who made their second gift within 3-month period of time. We want to follow up with what we do with second time donors. And that could be send them something about giving in the church. It could be inviting them into a small group. Everything is about discipleship, not getting their money. We're trying to get them deeper and deeper. And we know if we can get them more and more involved in the church, and we are inspirational and invitational, then we'll actually receive more.
So we have just one more question that we're going to respond to, and then we're going to wrap up. So question about engaging younger generations in giving and generosity. How do we do that? One person said, let's pray. That's a good start. And it sort of ties into another question that was about, are we encouraging churches to give up the pledge appeal? No, not necessarily encouraging people to give up the pledge appeal, but we do have to understand that the pledge experience is not the same for all generations. For those people at the high end of our giving list, they love pledging. Pledging is part of their DNA. It's part of who they are as a generation. Thanks be to God. But it isn't necessarily part of the DNA of the younger generations. And so I've been in churches where, and I'm sure you all have been in meetings where someone who's an older member of the church who's been chair of the stewardship committee for the last 10 years, who's one of your highest donors, says, we just need to get those 20 and 30-year-olds to pledge, and that would solve all of our resource problems. The challenge is that you just won't get them to pledge. Again, it's critically important that you have a recurring giving on your website, that's a really easy and fun for people to sign up for and to do. Recurring giving is really a way to get 20s and 30s to get started in their giving. But again, the primary focus, and this fits all generations really, is that spiritual aspect of giving and generosity. Why is it important for you as Christ disciple to be generous? And how can you grow in that generosity as you grow in your ability to give to the church and to those organizations that you love and care about? Joe, anything you want to add to that?
I would just say for most churches, I'm really pro annual campaign. You can grow out of that when you get generosity and tithing built into your DNA. Using spiritual, the spiritual benefits of somebody participating in what God is doing is absolutely foundational. The next is to show them how they can do that in very tangible ways. So we establish something we call a giving pathway, and it's identify where you are and then prayerfully consider taking the next step. But we don't ask for somebody to increase their giving by 5%, because if I give $100, 5% doesn't change much. But if somebody is already a regular giver, we ask them to prayerfully consider giving one or increasing whatever percent of their income they're giving by 1 or more percent. Now, for most of your donors, you're actually asking them to double or more than double their giving. And if you say, will you increase your giving by 100%? People light their hair on fire and run out the door. But if you will say, would you prayerfully consider increasing by 1 or more percent of your income as you work toward a tithe this year, and then gives them some tangible resources? Like, for instance, if you're going to get a 3% raise, you can enjoy 2%, commit 1% to God, and that's a tangible step. Many of the younger donors need something that like a financial management class for them to get a grip on their spending and their needs. So when you look at one of the practices in most non-denominational churches, it is that is one of the first things they try to do, is to get people into some kind of financial management class so they can begin to um, get control over their giving. It's a great way to get people connected to other ones in small groups, and then from there they try to get them involved in an ongoing Sunday school class or small group. There are some resources out there. Saving Grace is one that has a Methodist bent to it. It talks about Wesleyan giving. You might mention that Wesley was an Anglican priest. Foundationally connected. He died an Anglican priest, but the foundation of that practice that's taught in that is helpful, and it doesn't have all the loaded experience of like financial peace and all the things that are going on with the owner and being against debt, but having a mortgage company and things like that. So you may have to put helps out there to get younger people to be more generous. And at some point, it's up to the Holy Spirit to do the work. But if we're not actually cultivating the fields, it's on us that we're not seeing a fruit. I thank
Well,
you all for participating today. We encourage you to use our resources on Giving 365. Reach out to us. You can go to nextlevelgenerosity.com if you want to see some of the tactical stuff that we do around assessments and annual giving. We would certainly invite that. We're very open to conversations. I have 2, 3, 4 conversations on many days with churches that are saying, this is our problem or this is our need. And they haven't formed it up into a solution. We just start with, okay, tell me where it hurts, and let's talk about what might be next steps. And most of those churches don't ever engage us in a financial a contractual or coaching arrangement. They just need a little encouragement, need to be pointed in the right direction, and we certainly invite that.